Yes, Vancouver. I do recall that.
I just want to check.
Just remember, 10%.
Yes, we're good.
Okay, so we'll call to order this council workshop. We are now unrecessed as we had recessed to go into our special meeting. We're back. And welcome to two new members of the public. And we are over to Miss Atfa. Are you going to start us off?
Thank you very much, Acting Chair. Good evening, members of council and all in committee today. Thank you so much for this opportunity to come back, continue the short-term rental discussion. Ryan Gilmore is here to work through the presentation, and I will note that you received some slides today, a handout. We will be putting those up on the website as well. The earlier slideshow is attached to the council report. So a councillor asked me a few moments ago if everything is in the new one, almost everything, but not quite, because we'd like to do a little bit of a recap, but spend most of our time hearing comments around the regulatory framework options.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gilmore.
Thank you. Good evening, council. I'm Ryan Gilmore, planner with the planning department, and looking forward to picking up where we left off on April 17th in our discussion. But before doing that, I want to pick up on a couple of questions that came up during that workshop and provide some additional answers and clarity with respect to those. Specifically, there were questions regarding the number of listings in the district. So I'm going to provide some additional information on that. Some questions on the proposed provincial legislation and some questions about multifamily units and lockoff units. So I have a few short slides just to provide some additional information in those areas. So at the April 17th meeting, we reported that there were 653 active unique listings in the district. And that number was based on a January 30th web scrape that we had a consultant do. We've since updated that. So as of May 5th, so last Friday, there are now 832 unique short-term rental listings in the district. And that is just for the district. So that would exclude any addresses in the city. With respect to the anticipated provincial legislation coming this fall, we were able to get some additional clarification on the overall intent and scope of what that will look like. So overall, the province confirmed that local governments will retain jurisdiction over the regulation of short-term rentals through zoning bylaws and business licensing. They also confirmed that province or municipalities will be given additional tools to support bylaw enforcement. This will take the form of things like information sharing from the platforms and increased fines. And lastly, municipalities there'll be new mechanisms to hold platforms accountable, such as publishing listings that are compliant with local government bylaws and have valid business licenses. So overall, additional tools for local governments. And the message from the province was that local governments that have regulatory regimes in place, so zoning bylaws, business licenses, and active enforcement will be well positioned to take advantage of these new tools. Next, I just wanted to provide some additional information to support the discussion for multifamily dwellings. So I think it's important to note that multifamily dwellings, so stratas, townhouses, apartments managed by stratas, they have some additional tools available to them to manage short-term rentals in their buildings, tools that aren't available to single-family homeowners, for example. So these include the ability to pass bylaws to limit or prohibit short-term rentals in their buildings. They can levy fines against owners who are in breach of those bylaws. And like any neighbor, they can report infractions to the municipality if there's units operating in contravention of a regulatory regime at the local level. And in addition to this, our proposed regulatory framework would have additional checks in place. So in order for a strata unit to receive a business license bylaw, permission from the strata in some form would be required. And that would include confirming things like how parking is being provided. So there'd be a check on our side as well. So I just wanted to provide that additional context for the discussion of multifamily units. And then lastly, I just wanted to wrap up with some examples of this concept of principal residence. it can be hard to conceptualize at times, so I wanted to just spend a little bit of time going through it and explaining it and answer any questions about it right at the front. So these are just for illustrative purposes, but I'm going to walk through 2 scenarios for single family and then 2 scenarios for multifamily. So the first here is single family scenario. The main house you see here on the top left, this is the owner's principal unit. This is where the owner lives most of the year. That unit would be considered a principal residence and eligible for short-term rental. In this case, the secondary suite is vacant, so nobody lives there full time. So there's no long-term tenant. Because of that, it would not be eligible for short-term rental license because there is no principal residence requirement being met. And similarly, if in the situation where there's a coach house on this property, if there's no long-term tenant, the principal residence requirement is not being met. Therefore, a short-term rental license would not be available.
So, sorry, I just want to go back. So because they don't rent the coach house and they don't rent the secondary suite, short-term rental is not available. Under this proposed concept.
Correct. Because there's no long-term rental, no long-term tenants in either of those units, there's no principal resident and therefore wouldn't be eligible.
Mr. Milburn?
Just to clarify, one way to think about it is, in this scenario, that's 3 separate dwelling units. And so there is an owner, I guess in this example, there's an owner occupied principal unit. So that would be available theoretically under the proposed regulatory scheme to become a short-term rental. But because the secondary suite and the coach house are vacant in this example, the secondary suite and the coach house would not be available to have secondary suites within them because not currently occupied as a principal residence. So it's really treating each of the 3 as a separate unit.
Does everybody understand that?
No. Yes, but only because we met with them.
Okay, right. You guys you have a little bit of an advantage because I'm pretty confused by this. So the owner's principal resident unit, when you're saying that is a short-term rental, are you saying the whole top floor of the house is a short-term rental or a room in the house with a bathroom is a short-term rental?
So Ryan could probably answer this in terms of the options that were presented to the public. But that's a really important distinguishment. I think we had a question from a council that said, yeah, and I'll get to your full question, but just if I own this house, I own both the suite and the house, right? I'm the owner, I own both. But just because I'm an occupant in this portion does not mean I can just say, well, I'm going to have a secondary suite in this, we'll have a short-term rental in it because I own both. That's not what we're saying. We're saying you essentially have to be, this has to be your principal residence. Is this touchscreen? Is that one?
The clerk's messing around. No. There we go. We're back.
So just because I own both of these as one real estate entity does not mean I can just automatically have a short-term rental in the basement suite, right?
Why?
Why not?
Because you're not the occupant of the basement suite. You're the occupant of the principal residence.
Because
as the owner
is that could otherwise be used for long-term.
Right. That's what we
the
want.
objective, and that's what we want.
That's what we want.
The idea of having a principal residency requirement is that first and foremost, it's either a long-term owner or a long-term renter. And then they allow somebody to come in on some temporary basis to have a short-term rental use. That's the fundamental principle of principal residency. And the question about, let's just say, I think your question was about this unit. In this unit, does it mean one room or does it mean a floor, or what is the option?
It would be both. So in this case with the owner being the principal resident of the main unit, they would be eligible for a short-term rental license. They could choose to rent the entire unit when they're away on vacation, for example, or they could rent a room in their home while they're home.
But they couldn't rent the top floor for a short-term rental all the time and not live there.
Correct.
Okay. Jordan?
In your scenario, you got owner, but this could just as easily be a renter.
Yes. And then perhaps I'll move on to the second example. And
the owner rent.
So
sorry.
can we just go back to that for just a second? Because I think that's an important point, because right now what we used to have was if you wanted to have a secondary suite, you had to have the principal property owner live in either the basement or the top floor. I think some information that would be, you know, important for council is, you know, what have been the complaints over the years of having non-owners in the property? You know, because sometimes we have challenges with tenants not looking after things, we have complaints, and that bylaw enforcement issue is a big issue because we don't have enough people to enforce those kinds of things, and there's ways to sort of get around that. So we're still going along those lines that you don't have to be the owner of the house. You could be a long-term tenant, come in and sublet the bottom, or you could turn around and have a short-term. What constitutes a long-term renter?
Over 30 days.
Yeah, it's over, essentially over 30 days.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next, I don't know if next.
And this just illustrates kind of the other half of the scenario. So looking at the secondary suite option again, in this instance, the secondary suite is occupied by a long-term renter. So they have a lease, they rent it full-time. It's their full-time home. They're the principal resident. It is their principal residence. In that scenario, with the owner's permission, that tenant could apply for a business license to operate a short-term rental. So again, it's their principal residence. They live there full-time. They have the owner's permission, and they've applied for a business license to operate a rental. Again, for when they're on vacation.
Right, or a room in their basement suite with a separate bathroom or a shared bathroom. So that wouldn't be considered a lodger. Like we have bylaws that talk about lodgers, right? Like I think a student is a lodger, right?
Right, and the lodgers typically, again, stay on a more long-term basis. It's folks that are coming in and out of the suite on less than 30-day basis that we would define as being this short-term renter.
Okay. And a short-term renter, is there a minute? It's just one night? Could be a one night.
As little as one night.
It's less than, technically it's less than 9 days or 3 days, typically defined, yeah.
Okay. Herman?
We had a discussion about, the top and bottom, and I'm just trying to look at how it might be interpreted. Under the second scenario, if the owner lived upstairs, had an office downstairs, another bedroom downstairs, like how specific are you going to get to it? Like, is it considered still part of the principal? The owner's principal resident because he has an office downstairs, a bedroom that he wants to rent out as Airbnb. Like where are you going to draw the lines?
It's relevant, maybe I'll clarify, but it's likely depending on whether it's defined as a unit.
Yeah, in the scenario you just described, it essentially was an owner using their upstairs and their basement for their principal residence, right? Collectively. A secondary suite is a very specific thing. It's defined in the BC Building Code, and essentially it's a separate unit within the principal unit. Okay, and has fire separation, exiting, and all these kinds of conditions that apply to it. So if the owner is simply using both, is that the scenario you're thinking? They're just happen to be habitating within both? Yeah. That's one unit then. Yeah, and what that does is that avoids a loophole of somebody just saying, oh yeah, I'm really the resident in the basement. That's my principal residence, but I'm also, the upstairs is my principal residence. You can't have two at once. Right? It's either one is your principal, and if it's a fully built suite and you're occupying it, that's a secondary residence. That wouldn't be your principal residence. And we're recommending that you have a principal residency requirement. Yeah. Or else in the scenario I think you were worried about, somebody this would be their principal residence and then the owner, and then they have one short-term rental there and then one short-term rental in the basement. And we're saying that couldn't occur if you require a principal residency requirement for the unit,
for the secondary suite,
for the unit that has the secondary suite. Yeah.
So what if you had in the example too, if you had the owner living on the top floor and then you rented out your basement suite for a long-term tenant, and then you rented out your coach house for a long-term tenant, and then you could have either some basements are big, right? Some basements could accommodate a secondary suite and then an extra room, right? With a bathroom for a short-term tenant, or on the main floor, right? Because it's not one size fits all, because all these houses are different, right? So could you have both of those, and then in your main residence, have a room with a bathroom that you could use as a short-term rental?
Yeah, and that's a really key point that you're making is in this scenario where you have 3 units on the property, these are 3 distinct units. And as you described, there's a long-term renter and a long-term renter and an owner whose principal residence is the top here. One potential scenario is you theoretically could have short-term renters in all 3, right? 3 different separate business licenses. Also, home-based business in all 3, right? So it starts to have this cumulative impact that I think we want to be very cognizant of when we tailor our recommendations. And that gets a bit to the heart of some of the feedback we heard from the community. Some folks in the community felt short-term rentals should only be principal. Others from the community felt it should include these folks because they should be able to benefit equally as owners. But then there is a accumulation of total activity on the site that you might want to constrain or limit in some way because maybe 2 short-term rentals is enough, or 3 maybe isn't useful. It really is up to us to kind of tailor exactly what can work in our community. I would say that you would definitely want to think about limits though, because when you add a short-term rental, a short-term rental, a short-term rental, and 2 home-based businesses, 2 home-based businesses, 2 home-based businesses, and does one also become a bed and breakfast? Like you have to set limits, and our bylaw needs to do that. If we are to create a regulatory scheme, we have to think about the cumulative or additive effect of these uses on these sites and constrain them in some way so we don't have just flourishing, unlimited activity.
I just want to clarify that and then we'll continue on. I just want to clarify that I was just asking about the principal owner in the top floor, and then theoretically being able to rent out for long-term use, the coach house in the basement suite. But somewhere in there, if there was like summer, a summer need for students, trying to support tourism in that sense, right? Because there's part of it. Would we be open to allow a room in the main residence to act as like a bed and breakfast, which is really how they were first envisioned, right? Airbnb, is a different model. Okay, let's continue on. Mr. Gilmore, go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi.
The next 2 scenarios just pick up in it's the same concept, same theme, just applied to multifamily context. So here in the first example on the left, you have an owner resident. It's their principal resident occupying the unit on the left. Again, they would be eligible for a short-term rental license. The middle unit, long-term renter. So with the owner's permission, as the long-term tenant and it being their principal residence, they too could apply for a short-term rental business license. And then finally on the right, the townhouse unit is vacant. There's no long-term tenant. The owner could not apply and be successful for a short-term rental business license. So it's, again, that's the same concept just applied here in a townhouse.
So, like, who owns a townhouse? Who owns 3 townhouses in a row?
Sorry, yeah, I mean, the graphic may be confusing. It's not intended to show.
Like maybe multi-family in a tower.
The intention is to show 3 individually owned units here.
Okay, so one is a long-term renter, one is an owner, and then the third one is vacant, and somebody's just allowed to use that multifamily. I mean, that's up to the strata would determine whether or not that would be okay. Would the strata not trump our bylaws? Yeah,
It's additive. Stratas can prohibit short-term rentals, and we are proposing that if we create a scheme to allow short-term rentals, that we essentially verify through the business licensing process that the strata permits it to occur. If it doesn't, then the business license wouldn't be issued, because essentially that's a representation of the collective ownership rights through the strata. However, if it is allowed and the individual unit supports it, and they apply for the business license and comply, the long-term renter or owner could get a short-term business license for short-term rentals.
are there any questions on this slide? So this, sorry, Herman.
This, not specifically this slide, but just in general. If they're permitted to rent, is there going to be any? You talked about this like time limit, like is it 6 months plus 1 day that you have to be the occupant, and 6 months less a day, you can rent it out. Like, is there a requirement for a balance there?
So just to be clear, this is the definition of what is a principal resident. Okay, so the question mark is this person really a principal resident? They own it, but are they really the principal resident? And the question, is this person who rents on long term, are they really the principal resident, right? And this is a point I think is clear to folks that submit taxes or are seeking residency. Folks can potentially have multiple residences, right? Often at a point in time, I reside at my cabin on the lake in the summer, but I reside at home. But there isn't one principal residence. There always has to be one in which occupies most of their time. Okay. And the important thing is that there's some ways to verify that, right? And one of those is in terms of is your mail delivered there? Does your driver's license, say that's where you reside? There's kind of evidence that we would have to collect, and we would specify that in the bylaw, what criteria we think would be important. Every jurisdiction, like the federal government and others that have principal residency requirements, have their own sort of definitions of what qualifies as principal, and we would have to create one in the bylaw itself. But it would rely on those kinds of evidentiary examples that they would have to, prove to us essentially that that's their principal residence before they would be issued a business license under the proposal we have before you.
And if I may, some of that may also fall under the new provincial legislation. If everyone's having to register when they want to have an Airbnb, they probably likely have to provide some kind of documentation about ownership and residence.
Yeah.
We don't know, but
it's a great point. There's really this significant interest in the province to find out who's the principal residence and whether or not it's being a short-term rental. And that includes both the PST and the hotel tax they may collect on it if it's a short-term rental, but also whether or not the speculation and vacancy tax applies to the property, and also whether the principal residency rules that benefit municipal taxpayers as well, right? Is that your principal residence? We all do those declarations every year to say it's our principal residence. All that kind of data, the province wants to be able to collectively manage that so it can collect its taxes. But it also wants to, and they're indicating to us, that they want to share that information with us so that we can influence licensing and zoning rules as well, which would be incredibly helpful. That's challenging without that information.
Betty.
This is on subject, but a little bit off. Do we know how many corporations own short-term or long-term, whatever? But you know how corporations will go into an area when they think it's going to get developed and they'll start buying up houses in that area. Do we have any kind of data that will reflect how many situations like that we may have, or how many of those 800 units are corporately owned?
Yeah, the assessment role indicates ownership, and that identifies individuals who might own a property in common, but it also identifies if they're like a numbered company and so on. So we have that data. We would know by looking at this legal title, who owns the property. And actually, you can also then look up who are the directors of that company as well, right? They're in the corporate registry. So we could know that in advance. The key question, though, is who's residing there, right? Whether or not they're an owner or whether or not they're a renter. Staff are recommending that the principal residency requirement apply regardless. Somebody needs to have this as a principal residence, or else it's just essentially a hotel. It gets run like a hotel, which is inappropriate.
But a principal residence could be considered after 30 days, could it not? Is that not what you said? Principal renter?
Yeah, so
Activates after 30 days?
Yeah, so we'd ask for confirmation, like, is this, do you have a rental agreement on the property or a long-term lease? What information do you have? And also, has the owner of the property authorized you to have a short-term rental on that property? Those are key questions we would want to verify at the time of business license application.
Yeah, there's some bumps here for sure. Because after 30 days, I mean, you could have a renter leave. And then that renter, because you're defining a long-term renter, it being in a principal resident, right? A principal resident occupant is after 30 days. Is that what you're defining, a principal resident?
That's the definition of long-term rental. It's if they're renting typically on a month-to-month basis or a long-term lease, at least 30 days that they're renting it for.
Yeah, these are this is adopted, I see, from the City of Vancouver short-term rental. I mean, the City of Vancouver is a little bit different. They've got lanes, they've got a lot of coach houses, their housing stock is a little bit different from us. I mean, right now, just with the idea of that hotel, I'm thinking about Whistler when I think it was Vail Resorts. We're gonna go down to Squamish and they bought a house, a big house. And do you remember that story? And they were gonna originally use it to house their employees. And the municipality was like, no. This is a single family home. This is not a hotel. And they pulled out from that deal because it was, they realized what was going to happen. And I think we've got to look at municipalities that have already been through it. Like Whistler is a great example of, in some areas they allow short term, in other areas they don't allow short term. Short term in Whistler is anything less than 30 days. So it's a month is long-term rental. But it's the cost. And I know that Airbnb right now is not cheap lodging it once was. It's comparable to, any major hotel. In the summertime, I think the Holiday Inn, it's, close to $300 a night. Airbnb is pulling that off with, the rental of basement suites. In suites in the district of North Vancouver, we add a utility rate to those suites if you have a secondary stove in the building. That was the only way we could come up with a way to regulate what a basement suite was. And we wanted to be able to apply the costs of the utility to make it fair when people were having a monetary gain. I think Councillor Hampson last week talked about a tax. But we added that secondary stove. If you had a secondary stove, then you were going to pay, what is it, $125 extra, or it was a percentage. I can't remember how we calculated it. A couple of $100, something like that, that was added to the secondary suite. And if you didn't want to pay that, then you had to pull the stove out. So how are we going to deal with that in an Airbnb? Because a lot of these suites are being rented as Airbnb, $400, $450 a night, probably some way above that. And, with extras, they've got a full kitchen in there. Are they paying extra utilities based on that Airbnb?
Yeah, and I think when you refer to the regulatory scheme that was created many years ago, when the district thought about allowing secondary suites, I think it was even right around the time the province was actually defining it.
It was in 1996 because I was elected and I lived in a secondary suite and I voted against the bylaw.
What's changed since then is the definition of what is a secondary suite is very well defined in the BC Building Code. And it has sleeping, toilet, and cooking facilities, it has fire separation and exiting, and all these kind of rules that you would expect for a separate dwelling unit. And so as the older buildings get torn down and they get rebuilt, in some cases with suites, they're more and more, of course, complying to that standard. In fact, 70 to 80% of the new homes torn down and rebuilt in the district have a suite within them. So it's a very common type of conversion. And I think over time, we're going to see all the suites eventually come up to the modern standards. And it raises a key question. We want to make sure, as part of this business licensing scheme, that these places are safe for occupancy as well. Okay, I think we saw very unfortunate circumstances in Quebec where there was some Airbnbs going on in some structures that unfortunately had a fire and some deaths involved. And I think you make an excellent point that Airbnb, and not just Airbnb, but short-term rentals, whatever platform is used, right across Canada is something we can learn from and draw from those communities to see what has worked, what has not worked. Even today, there was an article from Toronto where the city of Toronto hadn't verified from the landlord that a short-term rental would be permitted. And so the tenant was able to essentially start to use it as a short-term rental despite there were strata bylaws that prohibited it. So those kinds of verification things are a good learning exercise for us here. Now that we're seeing how it's been applied in multiple jurisdictions, we know that we need to have some units that comply with BC Building Code standards. We know that we need to have units where the owner, if it's a rented unit, long-term, authorizes it, and the strata, if it's a strata situation. We've learned those things from others' mistakes, and I think we can create a regulation that work for the district.
Okay, so let's just go back to the question that I asked, which was in a secondary suite, if you want a secondary suite, you have to pay utility charges. And if you don't want a secondary suite, you got to pull out the stove. So an Airbnb in a unit that has cooking facilities, how are you going to, do the same rules apply? The utility rates will be applied to that secondary suite. I mean, if you look at a hotel, you can get a room or you can rent a suite. You can rent a lovely suite with 2 bedrooms, like an apartment, you know, in a hotel with cooking facilities, hot tubs, multiple bedrooms. You pay, obviously. You know, is that going to be, I mean, really what we're talking about is allowing, you know, scenario of hotels, short-term rentals into a single family or multi-family neighborhood. How are you going to regulate the utilities in regards to Airbnb if you allow a top floor of a house, for instance?
Well, one way to look at it from a utility perspective is that, can you just go back to the suite example?
Already collecting it.
Yeah, if it is a secondary suite, it
That's
already has the fixtures in place to allow residential occupancy. And so if it's long-term rented on a long-term basis, but it happens to be a short-term rental, essentially you're not really increasing the overall average demand of that unit because it's already essentially a suite. It's got a permanent resident or occupant within it. And as Ryan mentions, we're suggesting it would have to be that in order to meet this definition to allow short-term rentals. So it wouldn't necessarily increase the overall utility load from that perspective.
Thank you. That was the point I was going to make, is that we would already be collecting that because there would be a long-term tenant there, right? So.
Is there going to be, is it like right now our system for secondary suites or pretty much anything is 1 complaint? And I would get council to really think about that system, how that works. And that was the reason I voted against the secondary suite bylaw, because I felt it was unfair that just 1 person could complain about a neighbor with a secondary suite. It should be 2 or 3, because you could just not like your neighbor for whatever reason. And we've had those scenarios before in the past. So is it just going to be 1 complaint about a secondary suite? And we've had, or short-term rentals, we have had complaints before in neighborhoods about short-term rentals where they've been used for conventions. I think we took one property owner to court. You know, rowdy parties, the owner's not there, they live in another part of the region, and you know, every weekend, you know, 10 people show up and start partying on decks, and you know, we don't have enough people to go and enforce it or shut it down, and the police are called and they're busy, and you know, how are we going to enforce this kind of thing when we're already challenged under enforcement right now?
Yeah, so if council agrees to kind of create a regulatory scheme for short-term rentals and permit them under certain circumstances, whatever those are, staff would recommend that there be a business licensing fee. Those fees be directed towards staffing resources to essentially help with enforcement related to it. So you would essentially collect more fees so that you could have more staff to enforce the rules that council puts in place. With respect to 1 complaint or 2, we operate based on 1 complaint. That doesn't mean that we enforce. We investigate based on the complaint, right? And if at the end of the investigation we determine that there's a breach of the bylaw, well then, of course, progressive enforcement can't sue. What happens most often is we ask the person to comply and they comply voluntarily. So that's where we start from: investigation, voluntary compliance, and then enforcement. But we don't rely on multiple complaints. And the reason is, that's actually very easy to get. Anybody if I'm complaining about my neighbor, let's say this is 2 houses and I'm here and I have 4 family members, 2 family members, is that 2 complaints or not? Also, it forces owners, because we would tell them, oh, you have to go to somebody else that's complaining. And all they do is walk across the street and go to their neighbor and say, hey, you know, help me fight this person. And then you start to create this kind of conflict potentially unnecessarily in the community. So we've certainly investigated that and what other communities do. And communities typically do not respond and require a threshold of multiple complaints. What's really useful though and important to know is that we do take that as a bit of an indication of the potential nuisance effect in the community. If we have multiple people complaining, that means it's likely a bigger, broader issue that's spreading out into multiple residents. So it potentially elevates this important level of concern with us when there is multiple complaints. But that doesn't mean that we then diminish the 1 complaint, because it might be completely valid.
Betty?
I was 2 points. 1 point is what you're talking about, Councillor Murray, and that is enforcement. This is something much like dog licenses that becomes more the person willing to step up and say, I have this in my basement. If they don't, then we don't know, and it's not enforceable. So you can have one neighbor that's following all the rules and doing everything, and you can have another neighbor who's not and getting away with that. So I'm really concerned that the more you try to put in bylaws and rules, if we can't enforce them in an efficient, fair way, then I think we're doing a disservice to people because it's not a level playing field. The other thing is, hasn't been mentioned yet, maybe you're going to mention it later in your presentation, I don't know. But there's nothing indicating, or even in the reading, what I'm reading is, that a neighbor next door to this kind of situation has some kind of input. Because maybe, I mean, there's just, you know, there's no example of how this is going to affect the neighborhood. So I'm concerned about that, you know, you could plunk these, you could have all one side of the street with this kind of a situation and all the parking being taken up by them. And then the other side of the street gets angry. So you're going to start those conflicts in a neighborhood. And I'm really concerned about that. So I don't know, is there something that will be coming up where, I mean, if there's a neighbor to one of these things and it's short term and they're coming in for less than 30 days, then the owner of the short term rental could say, well, they're gone now, there won't be any more problem.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in terms of the first point you made is, how would we ever know about these? Right, that's a key thing. And I think what the industry has demonstrated is that the online platforms seem to be generating most of the traffic. It isn't that somebody is putting it up on Kijiji or something that you know, it's really these online platforms like Airbnb and so on. So a key part of this approach has been, for many communities, has been going to these third-party data scrapers and trying to pull the data from folks. Vancouver then took that a step further and said, we're going to negotiate a deal with Airbnb whereby they'll ensure that all the people advertising will have to show their business license, okay, to create that kind of back and forth verification. The province is proposing to take it a step further and apply that to all online platforms, that if it's on the online platform, it becomes a data set that the province can then use to enforce its tax rules and also give to local governments so that we can enforce our short-term rental rules. And that's how we would catch them. How would we ever know? It's because essentially an imposition of a requirement on the online platforms like Airbnb to share that data with us. That's a key part of success, I think, long-term for this. In terms of neighborhood input, I think that would be very challenging to go through and require neighborhood input on 500 or 800 different short-term rentals in the community, if that was acceptable to council. That potentially is unworkable. What would work, though, is whatever regulatory scheme council creates in terms of limitations, right, such as this principal residence requirement. All those rules added up creates essentially a standard for the community. Okay, and then you would have the confidence that we're going to enforce that standard using the tools that you've given us, right? And the enforcement powers and the staff. Okay, that would be the point, just create a regulatory scheme that you would see and approve all the bylaws, all the fine systems, all the resourcing, and the fees and fines, so that it could be enforced to those standards, as opposed to it being like a discretional decision that council has on a one-off basis for everyone. That would be unworkable based on the volume of potential applicants. That's the same for home-based business. So right now, people can apply for a home-based business, and as long as they meet the criteria in the bylaw, they get issued the business license, right? And if they start to operate in a way that's a nuisance to their neighbors, that may trigger us to come out and ensure it complies.
Betty, we've just got a couple more. Quick follow-up.
Yeah, with all due respect, I'm constantly getting emails that we don't enforce our bylaws. And I get a constant stream of people, whether it's lighting, whether it's nuisance, whether it's noise. And either the district comes out and maybe looks at it and tries to do the neighbor routine, and it causes great problems in some neighborhoods. So I'm leery of the more regulations we put in, the more harm we're doing if we can't enforce them. So that's a big if. I mean, we have to be able to enforce, otherwise don't bother putting in regulations.
Catherine?
Well, I just want to emphasize that with the, just following up on what you're asking about the enforcement, you know, really with the provincial legislation, that will be the hammer of enforcement because people will have to register as an Airbnb. And once they do, and we have that data, then it will make enforcement vastly easier than us just doing it on our own. So I feel confident that if the province does come through, which I think you said that in the fall with this legislation, and everybody like the homeowner's vacancy tax has to register, that will force them to register. So the hundreds right now, 800 and something that are currently operating will actually become part of the data and they'll be on the books, so to speak. So I think my opinion is that it will actually be better and regulated and better enforced, particularly when it comes to any kind of problematic issues.
Can I just respond to that?
Yep.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I agree the 800, because they're already on platforms, they're going to be caught in, or not the word caught, but they're going to be
Identified.
identified, better word, thank you. But anyone new coming in may not be, because they may not use those platforms. And also, and even if they do, enforcement will physically come down to the district to enforce.
But
So that's what I'm concerned about.
I'm guessing it's going to be like space vacancy, the vacancy, like if they don't register, if those young people don't register, they'll probably face rather large fines.
Well, first you have to find them, then you find with a D on the end, and then you find them with an E on the end. So
Okay, well, we'll see. Mr. Stewart, you have comments?
Yeah, just one question, maybe Dan could, because we're starting to focus on the enforcement side. How many issues of enforcement do we end up with every year around short-term rentals?
There were 28 in 2022, and so far this year there's 15
Those are individual
complaints.
complaints. And so we receive those through request for service and those come in by
Addresses.
Those are, yeah, just to clarify, those are 22 unique addresses complaints from 2022 and 15 unique.
can I ask what main, is it noise, is it parking, is it traffic? Is there sort of, do you have any idea what the main complaints?
It's exactly those. It's those nuisance complaints that you would anticipate. So it's perfect parking, noise, seeing strangers walking next door, type of thing.
How many bylaw complaints total in every department do we get? There you go. That's a number that we might want to take a look at. I bet it's bigger than 28.
Yeah, we can certainly provide that. I don't
Yeah.
have that number because we have a bit of a dispersed model for enforcement. We have folks, park rangers who are out enforcing and issuing tickets in the field, bylaw officers who do the predominant issuance of tickets because they're related to parking. And we've periodically provided those updates to council on how many fines were issued and can certainly provide that to council. I think and council's really hitting on a key topic here is that if we're going to create a regulatory scheme, we need the resources and we need good regulations that are easy to interpret and enforce, and we need staff in place to enforce them. 100% agree with all those.
Okay, so we need to get those numbers back, and there's a few of us that haven't gone to the one-on-one sessions to sort of clarify and get some more of this information, because it said that we were bringing this back on June 26th, so I thought I had a little bit more time. And so, you know, 3 of us may take you up on your offer of coming and sitting down and sort of going through this, so we're as up to date on the information as Councillor Pope back and Ma. So I think we need to have that number, but I would say with the, you know, the issue of bylaw enforcement, and we do need to have a session on that. I know we've been talking about that as well. You know, and yes, we have rangers and parks and things like that, but I think we need to also understand what the process is for that process of a complaint and what happens, how it's dealt with. You know, I've had experiences with you know, neighbors that have complained about short-term rentals where the short-term rental exists, and then when we phone and say we're going to have to come and do an inspection, they kind of don't exist anymore in the same way they did before the neighbor complained, right? So there's a lot of nuances with you know, managing this sort of thing. And I guess, you know, I think Catherine had made, you know, an earlier mention of this at the beginning of the conversation, but I think our primary goal in all of this is to protect that long-term rental. And what is happening around the region in other communities, what is happening in places like Whistler, where they cannot get accommodation for people that are working in the community, and we're having that problem. I think there was an article out of the Globe and Mail or the Vancouver Sun recently that talked about we are the demoviction capital of Canada in Vancouver. We are demovicting more people in Vancouver than Toronto. We have the highest rental rates in North America, I believe, in Vancouver. And, you know, these kinds of properties with all of this stuff, their assessments rise, their value rises, costs rise, and it all sort of, you know, contributes to this unsustainable place that we are living in. And we really have to have, so I think it's really important to, with all of these slides, and thank you for the pictures, I'm visual, so it's very helpful. Just keep going down that road of pictures. I think we have to have that other side of the coin, that other side of the pendulum, where we talk about what has Airbnb, or, you know, I mean, it's just the term, you know, TripAdvisor, Expedia owned, Priceline, bed and breakfast, whatever we want to call it. Where are the numbers to show us how it's impacted those long-term rentals and the housing in our community?
Oh, there's tons.
I know. And but we should have that as part of the presentation when we're talking about this, so we know, so we can try to find that balance, that middle ground, where we do offer short-term accommodation to people that are coming to our community to visit, but we also have that fair balance with long-term rental to support the people that are working in the tourism sector. They're some of the lowest paid jobs, you know, the hotels, you know, the restaurants, you know, they have some of the lowest wages and they're struggling, you know, they are struggling, right? You know, so I think we really need to have that information at the same time so we can find that balance. Because with these presentations, I feel like we're trying to justify how we're going to do this. And again, when we look at the pictures, we're as Catherine pointed out, you know, the goal is to protect the housing stock. I guess I'm still uncertain about the principal, you know, it's not an owner of the property, it's the principal occupier. That could be a long-term rental being 30 days. I mean, I think a long-term rental, I'm not going to really give you the, you know, long-term button unless I know that you've looked after my place for a year, you know, and I have rental properties. So it's a business too that's you know, not the easiest business to be in. Short-term rentals, it's a lot of work. Okay, so we're going to go to Dan.
Just to respond to your question, how many of these are negatively impacting long-term rental? And we don't know the answer to that question. We know a really significant portion, but we do know from other communities that have implemented a regulatory scheme and required that principal residency as a condition of getting a short-term rental license, is that the total number of advertised short-term rentals decreased dramatically, like up to a third in some cases, because people couldn't meet that residency requirement. So you can assume that likely they weren't complying. The challenge with us right now is it's a prohibited use. So people know that going into it. They know they're doing something that was not permitted by the zoning bylaw of the district. And so they're going to operate it hopefully in a way that won't result in complaints, but we respond to on a complaints basis. But we do not know how they operate it, whether they're a long-term renter and they're enforcing that principal occupancy rule? I suspect not, because frankly, they're not following our rules to begin with. So it is a significant impact. And I think I talked to him today and mentioned that maybe we can show a couple examples to council of where the principal residency rules have been applied and what that did to the total number of units that were licensed or at least known in a community. And we can maybe give a couple examples and that can give us some idea of what we might experience.
And maybe bring forward some of the, the data that Catherine's talking about. Like there's a lot of evidence to show the impact on long-term rental. We don't have an exact number, but it's out there. So maybe bring some of that forward. And
Well, Lisa, when you think about Councillor Murray's, right?
yeah.
When you think about it,
Got
every
this.
Airbnb is displacing a long-term rental.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of things that we have to put into this. The last thing, and then I'll go to Betty, from my perspective, is the impact to a neighborhood. All neighborhoods are different. Some neighbors can take on all of it, plus a couple of businesses, no problem, because of the neighborhood that they live in. Areas like Norgate, for instance, really shortcut lots, small lots, and some places in Norgate, not all of Norgate, but a lot of them are really tiny lots. It's harder to bring, parking in to be able to accommodate this kind of thing. I would say you're suggesting that, people know that they're doing something wrong if they have a short-term rental in the district. No, they don't. I had a discussion with engineering today because all of a sudden we've put up signs on a street in the Seymour saying no parking. And there's been parking on the street for, since we began. And all of a sudden they're going to put parking signs up because it's always been no parking on the street in our bylaw, but we just haven't signed it. And people should know. And I'm like, how do they know? I mean, they don't know. If the sign says don't park, well, then they know. But if there's no sign and they've been parking there for 47 years and no one said anything, and bylaw officers go up and down the road every day and no one's getting a ticket, how would they know? People don't know. We think they know, but they do not know until they're told you're not allowed to do this. Then they know. Or there's a complaint that comes in. So we can't assume anybody knows anything. And I will bring you back to the Hotel Association telling us that they were taking a fee or a tax for the short-term rentals, even though we don't allow them. And they didn't even know. And yet they were taking money from the short-term rentals in the district. And it was against our bylaw. So I think we have to sort of maybe step back from that assumption and assume that, not everybody knows all of our bylaws. Betty, and then we're going to go to some people in the audience if they have if there's no other comments from council. So we'll go to Betty, and if anybody else has something to say, go for it. And then we're going to go to the audience for comments.
One request, when I was asking about the corporate ownership, I really appreciate getting those numbers for everybody. And the other thing is council, at least the last term I was on and so far on this term, densification, which is what this is. Densification, councils have looked at it as a benefit, something to benefit the community. So when I'm looking at short-term rental, I don't see how the community benefits on that. But if I'm looking at long-term rental, I definitely do, because we can provide housing for people who work here or don't want to commute to here and back and forth. So that's just my point of view. I want to save housing for the people who are looking for long-term housing, not the people who are on a holiday and want to find a place that takes it out of our stock, and so that the cashier at Safeway can't find a place to live, or down-evicted people can't find a place to live. So my priority is long-term, not short-term.
Herman.
Thank you, Acting Mayor Murray. In our discussion earlier, we had a pretty fulsome discussion, and we did say that preserving rental housing stock was important. But there's also other interests that we need to balance. In terms of affordability, at least in my neighborhood, almost every new home going in has a mortgage cover. Does that make it more affordable for them to buy that place? So that's one thing. And the other thing we talked about is, as you mentioned, Lisa, sorry, Councilor,
That's okay.
the Vancouver North Shore Tourism Association is currently benefiting from the tax that the government collects on short-term rentals. And, there's some discussion about lack of a better word, clawing that back. So, there's going to be potentially some impact on tourism as well, trying to support businesses. So I think there's some things to think about. I wouldn't say they're the major driver, but that is something that we need to consider as well when we look at these regulatory schemes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, we're on the North Shore, depending on how you look at it. We've got some of the biggest tourism destinations in the region. Capilano Suspension Bridge, Grouse Mountain, Deep Cove. Those are the three top ones. Lynn Headwaters, sorry.
Cleveland Dam.
Yeah, the Cleveland Dam, the headwaters. So those are, some, and, some of them are public, government run, some of them are private. It's those other supports as well that support those industries. So there does have to be a balance, but it all needs to balance it all. It can't tip one side to another and favor one over another. So that's why the information is really important.
If I could just add, just to kind of help reinforce that point, I think the Tourism Association can't be overlooked in terms of how they do support small business. And talking to some of the small businesses, I know in areas like Adjournment Village, they rely heavily on that summer tourism crowd. When locals go away in the middle of July and August, it gets pretty quiet, but they do benefit greatly from the tourism. So I think if we are going to be talking about how that funding is, how it's channeled, and if we are looking at potentially directing it away from the Tourism Association, I think they need to be consulted as part of this process. It's that is the right thing to do. They play an important role right now. So
you think maybe using that money to spread out a little bit further, potentially? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, no, I wanted to know kind of how they're using that money currently,
right,
and
okay.
Make sure that they're consulted as part of any changes that happen. I don't think that's up for us to decide when they, I can imagine that was it $200,000 last year that was collected represents a pretty big part of their budget. However they came about it, and how it came to be is what it is. But I think we need to work with them rather than say, we're going to all of a sudden take this funding away from you. I don't think that's the right thing to do at all. So just to highlight that. There was something else I was going to say, but I'll come back to it.
John, are you only at slide 5?
Yeah, maybe we could get through
We've
it.
got 2 more slides. So the options, is that what you're bringing up? Yeah.
The last portion of this slide was just a further discussion of the principal residence requirement. I think we've covered that pretty well, so I won't necessarily spend any time on that. And the last 2 are, yes, they're just recaps from the previous workshop. So I can go through these quickly. The first one is on the regulatory framework options. This is where we're spelling out the options for which housing types to permit short-term rentals. So option A is all housing types. This would be single-family homes, including suites and coach houses, and any multi-family dwellings as well. Option B is single-family homes and multifamily, but it would exclude suites and coach houses. Option C is single family only, so no suites, no coach houses, and no multifamily. And option D is status quo, so unregulated.
So when I'm looking at that though, you're saying option B, no suites and coach houses, and that remains, but you have a check mark. You should have an X.
Yes.
It looks like it's included.
I can see that.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
There's that visual of me coming in, right? Like that doesn't make sense to me at all. You're saying it's not included, but it is included there when I see it. Okay.
Yeah, I guess the checks and question marks are used to indicate perhaps kind of the pros and cons, if you will, of the opportunities and challenges of each. So for option B, if your priority was to perhaps limit short-term rentals in suites and coach houses by excluding them from the framework altogether, that's one way to do it. So that might be seen as a positive. I think that's the intent.
Councillor Hanson, do you have any comments?
Thank you very much, Acting Mayor Murray. I mean, I spoke at the last workshop and expressed my broad philosophy that we should be regulating short-term rentals because we're not going to succeed in eliminating them through prohibition. We should be imposing a significant tax and using that tax to address issues of social and affordable housing. And I believe that such a strategy, in combination with the benefits it brings to business and tourism, overall economic development in the district, will provide more benefit than any kind of prohibitionist model with respect to short-term rentals. And in that regard, I then would favor the broadest interpretation, both of the property type and of the location and setting of the short-term rentals. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Jordan? Okay. Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess if we are trying to land on an option here or voice our position, I'll state that I agree with Councillor Hanson. I think in terms of being providing equal opportunities to everyone, regardless of whether they rent or own their home, and regardless of what type of home they live in, I prefer option A. I don't think the status quo is going to serve us well. I think we want the community to benefit from this. Part of that is having a proper regulatory framework. So I think in terms of opening it up, across the community and just providing equal opportunity, option A makes the most sense in my opinion.
Catherine?
Yes, I agree with that. I think we absolutely have to have a regulatory framework for Airbnbs with the goal of ensuring that we have as many long-term rentals in our housing stock as possible. It's my understanding from the meeting previous to this one that this could potentially open up, 200-300 extra rental units just within the district, which would have a huge impact on people who are desperately needing rental housing right now. So I also would be in favor of option A, opening up all housing types. And the thing I like about it is the staff recommendation that it only be those housing types where there are permanent residents living in them, permanent rentals, so that they could potentially open up for just a short period of time for Airbnbs, but it would be available to all housing types and therefore provide owners with a little extra income if they were going to open it up for a month, but not displace renters. And I like also Councillor Hanson's idea of taxing, potentially in addition to the tax that is already being collected by the Tourism Association, or that is given to the Tourism Association, that's collected from the online platform, potentially looking at an additional tax for Airbnb owners.
Thank you. Councillor Forbes?
Just a question. How come wasn't an option where it was just multifamily? You've got a single family only, and then you've got single family and multifamily, and then you've got all the housing types. But why did we not have a category of just multifamily?
For sure. I believe staff derived these categories based on the kind of feedback we heard from the community. So these kind of reflect where people seem to be leaning, the various types. And I don't believe we got a lot of interest from folks that said just multifamily. I think it was one of these types where the preferred interest lay in the folks that responded to the surveys and engagement.
Is there an option that you are looking at, Councillor Forbes, of the ones up on the screen?
We're not making a decision tonight.
No, we're not making any decisions tonight. We're just asking you, out of those ones, which would you like to sort of investigate further? And you have not had the opportunity to sit down with staff one-on-one to sort of go through all this, either have I. So I'm going to do that. But is there one that sort of pops out?
Well, I'm just in the back of my mind, I'm paying attention to the OCP and paying attention to where densification, which is again what this is. And that was supposed to happen in town centers, which are multifamily. So that's why I'm asking that question. And we are going to develop the main arterial roads out of the town centers. That's where the densification would come in. And yet we seem to be referring to single family all the time, single family neighborhood. And the OCP specifically says we densify in our town centers and major arterial roads first, and that we protect and we be sensitive to the single family areas. So I kind of think this is a little bit slanted. Now, if I had to say what I'm looking at, I'm between, if I had to choose one, it would be between A and D.
A and D?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it D or D?
D.
D, yeah.
Okay.
Because of some of the issues that I brought up.
Councillor Ma?
I can ask, through your worship.
Yeah.
Ryan, can you just clarify, in terms of the options, which one would provide the most stock for long-term rental housing?
Good question.
Keeping in mind that the
I don't think so.
principal residence requirement would be applied in all scenarios. Any suites or coach houses or multifamily units that would be eligible to be short-term rentals would be either owned and occupied by the owner or a long-term rental. So all these, in theory, as you say, would protect long-term rental equally based on that universal requirement across all three. So there's no scenario here where the principal residence requirement doesn't apply. It applies to all. It's with the exception of the status quo.
Right, but it's predicated on a principal.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, and then if I were to taking that into account, thank you for that clarification. And looking at option B and C, where the business license revenue may not cover it. Now, and part of the objective here is to generate some extra revenue to put towards the housing fund, right? So if B and C may not cover it, then I'm only left with one option. So
Which option is that?
A.
Okay, so I think there's a few questions that we have. The taxation issue, that's an interesting one that I think we're all interested in looking at that. I think the information in regards to how much revenue we're actually talking about to be put into the affordable housing fund would be a number that we would be interested in, as well as what kind of impact does this have depending on these scenarios on long term. Like it looks like all these scenarios are going to protect it in a better way than we've got right now. But what kind of impact does short-term rental have on our existing housing stock? And then we're going to change the ticks to the X's so the visual makes sense to me. And we're going to go to Catherine, is going to be the last speaker, and then I'm going to go to our.
We haven't gotten to the last slide yet, which is about the.
Do you want to do the license caps ahead of us not having that extra additional opportunity to speak to staff? That's why I'm being kind of a little bit.
Clarification on my question.
Okay.
So the question of densification has been raised here. In my opinion, from what I've heard, it's a net zero. Like there's no densification because otherwise the places are being used.
They're already there.
They're already there. They're already being used. What is your opinion? Is this densifying?
The existing short-term rentals are spread throughout the community. And they generally reflect the existing density of housing in the community. So they're really spread out throughout. So we don't have them in one area. The councillor is correct. In now and in the future, multifamily will be the predominant form of housing, both in the community as a total quantitative amount, but also definitely in the town centers along corridors. That's where you want to have multifamily types of units. I think Brian answered the question with respect to its impact.
Here we go. Is that answer it, Catherine?
No. Are Airbnb regulations going to densify or not?
No, there would be no new units created as a result. Some folks who have an existing.
Not units, she's talking
People.
about people.
Cars,
An
people.
increase in, I think that's what you mean by densification.
Well, I also meant that once we pass these rules, people who don't have a coach house or don't have a basement suite, and we're talking about incentives. in
Might
there
do
to
it
make-
for,
They might go ahead
For the
and do
money.
that. They might go ahead and do that, and then that would.
it might be more lucrative.
Yeah.
But they have to be renting initially, so it's some, you can only, back to that, the chart.
But maybe they're not renting right now.
But they-
If we have some kind of this where they get an incentive to make their basement into a suite, and then also they're gonna get rent to help them as a mortgage help or whatever. You may have people start renting out some of their principal,
Well, that would be a good thing, because then we'd have more rental housing
not
stock.
short term, long term.
No,
not
But you
short
need to
term.
have that short term, sorry, you need to have the long term tenant.
Yes.
In order to be able to accommodate the short term.
Exactly.
You're not adding any
No
anybody.
additional people.
Yeah.
Because it's either gonna be the long-term resident.
Suite right now, because you do the basement suite, get in a long-term renter, you could then short-term. rent it.
Well, I for one would
That would
be
be a benefit.
encouraging homeowners to have more suites and
Oh,
more
I am too.
basement suites so that they can have long-term rentals.
I am too.
And so the only way they can have an Airbnb is if if they've got a long-term tenant.
And have a short term without a long term.
So it's
Yeah.
not an additional person.
But the person that benefits from that short-term rental is the tenant,
Yeah, not the.
not the homeowner.
Unless they make a work out the rent.
Right, like you pay me 50% of your take.
I think you guys have had an extra couple of hours on this, and we just got the email inviting us last week. And some of us were away at a convention and didn't get an opportunity, and the June 26th date, it's highlighted in blue. So some of us thought we had a lot more time to be able to go in and sit down and make that appointment. And then this was scheduled for tonight, so we thought that was in addition to. So that's why I'm being a little bit on the license caps. That's a big issue, and you guys have probably already talked about it this afternoon. Oh, you didn't? Okay, so I think it's a big one, and I do want to get to the public. So go
I just
ahead.
want to make one point on all the questions that were asked from the councilors we spoke to today and the answers given.
You sent them out.
Prepared an email and sent to all of
Yeah.
council, so you can have that going forward.
Yeah,
Getting back to that interesting debate that was going on, I would say the one market signal that is not working is in the current status quo situation. People are currently not paying their full fare.
fair, yeah.
They're not paying for the enforcement, they're not paying for a number of things because they're not capturing it. We're just saying you're prohibited and we're responding on a complaints basis. Under the proposed short-term rental system, it would be more correctly sending the right market signals by having fees, by having licensing fees that people have to pay every year, by ensuring they're going through the provincial online platform regulatory system, being tracked, paying their fair share, and that would send the right market signal.
Can you bring back a number where you think the 800 and whatever are that we know about? And, well, I guess we haven't set any fees or anything, but compare with the fees that maybe Vancouver charges and see what kind of revenue that 800, whatever the number is, represents.
Yeah, and that's where if council wants us to go down the regulatory scheme, we would definitely come back with specific recommendations about the types of fees that would make sense to ensure we had enough revenue to pay for the enforcement. And then, of course, we would answer that question that was asked by a couple of councillors tonight about taxation, whether that can play into it. And thirdly, the online platform revenue that is currently provided to the Vancouver North Shore Tourism Association provides more commentary on that after consulting with them.
Can you just give us ballpark? I mean, not right now. I mean, I'm sure
Yes.
you need to go away. and
Yes,
figure
they
it
can.
out, But just ballpark, yeah, ballpark figures for what the tourism board gets, regulated, what potential revenue we're getting.
Yeah, we can provide that.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to that last.
It's gonna be a sliding scale though.
Yeah.
We have 832 now, a third of them just get out of the business.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
it'll
the
be-
regulations, then it's gonna be 500.
Yeah.
If it's $100, it's that.
No, yeah.
but we can use anecdotal evidence from other municipalities that do have regulations now and see what happened to them and how it would impact us. So now we're gonna go to the last slide and just sort of run through that. I don't know how much I'm not sure which is a tick and which is an X.
So I can quickly summarize again.
Yeah.
So again, for the visuals, the ticks are opportunities and the question marks are considerations. So option A, this is night limits. This is a specific number of nights, or excuse me, yeah, days per month or year. And the challenge with this one requires data sharing. You need the nightly data to understand when a unit was rented. It's very complicated without.
Yeah.
It's very complicated with the data, frankly. So those are the challenges with that one. Option B, license caps. This is where you would limit the number of licenses. You would put a cap on the total number of licenses for a jurisdiction for the district, for example, or you might put smaller scale caps at the neighborhood or even a block level. And that's been applied in a few jurisdictions in BC, usually smaller municipalities. There's the key challenge with that is the fairness component. How do you define who gets the licenses if you're bumping up against the cap? So that's a key challenge with that one. Option C, time limited. This is where you would specify the number of months, perhaps per year, or even weeks per year that a license would be valid. So when you apply at the beginning of the year for your license, you would say, I want a license to be valid for 2 weeks in December, 4 weeks between July and August. And the challenge with that is it's not too flexible. Vacation plans change. We might see a lot of desire to amend their applications after they've submitted them initially in the beginning of the year. And so it could be administratively challenging. And then option D is no license caps. So this is obviously the easiest to administer. And we can focus on enforcement of the principal residence requirement. And it's a little bit easier to communicate as well, because it's not complicated. So.
Okay. So we're just going to do a little go around. If anybody has any idea, if you don't have an idea about what you would agree to, then that's okay. But just give us sort of an indication of what you might consider. And like Councillor Forbes, who said, there isn't an option for multifamily only, I would say, I guess maybe it would fall under option B, which is to look at the Whistler model, where there is sort of one area that looks after the visitor, and then areas that look after the support for the visitors in regards to long-term rental and short-term rental. There's two.
B or D?
No, I just said B. It's sort of like that, the license caps, but it's areas that would support short-term rentals versus those that would support long-term rentals. It's not the same kind of community. It's a tourist community in Whistler, so it's got a different but there is a longer, it is growing into a longer term municipality for people that, are raising their families there, et cetera. So I would just throw that out. So we'll just go background. So we'll start with Councillor Batt.
I tend to lean towards option D, no sort of caps. I think it does make it simpler to enforce. And I think just the principal residence component of this kind of deals with what I think would be any negative aspects to it. For the most part, I mean, these are residents who live in their home for most of the year. So I don't think we're going to find, they're renting them out every weekend or weeks on end throughout the year. So I just think from both, from the enforcement perspective, that having no caps.
Councillor Pope?
Makes sense.
I think I really would like to have more understanding of how it has worked in other jurisdictions.
Examples.
But I also lean towards option D, no license caps. I think that my biggest concern is about the massive, these other options sound like they would be just fraught with administrative
red tape
problems, and I just can't imagine how we could possibly staff that. But so that would be if I had to go with one.
Okay, Councillor Hanson.
No caps, option D. Thank you.
Okay. Good. I tend to lean towards option D too, with the proviso that, as we move forward, and if there's any need to look at anything different, we could amend in the future. And maybe some of the challenges of looking at that kind of path amending later. What are the pros and cons to doing that? So that would be my comment. Councillor Forbes.
I would agree with what Councillor Hope said about A, B, and C. It just looks, I mean, they all say high administrative and high enforcement and fairness concerns. So A, B, and C wouldn't be something I look at, but I'm not interested in short-term rental. I'm interested in long-term, so I wouldn't pick D either.
You should have put X's on all of those. You're using the X's and the check marks. Councillor Ma.
No, it's interesting. I would generally agree with the group on option D, but I also like the idea of potential areas, as you were saying in Worcester model. And I hear the comment that this would be difficult to administer. The one thing I would think about is using technology. If we do get into a partnership, potentially, have the province negotiate this with those, operators like Airbnb, there should be a way to program on their application, like put a cap in, region. So if I book 5 nights and oops, this homeowner's hit their limit, I wouldn't be able to complete my transaction. Like I think if we're not doing this because it's this administrative challenge, then I think there's a technology solution. But in terms of principle, I kind of like the idea of caps in certain areas, if that could be done. I understand the concept of fairness, but I just kind of look at Whistler to say, hey, there's certain areas that we may not want more activity, right? So,
okay,
I'm kind of thinking D, but potentially B if it makes sense.
okay. Okay, good. Phew. Okay, we've tackled this one, I think. Getting there. Deep breaths. Okay, so now we've got 4 members of the public. We do offer an opportunity for some comments. We ask that they be as succinct as possible and brief, not like us. So do you have any comments?
No, that was great discussions. I'm not here. I wasn't here for this topic, but I found it very, very interesting.
Oh, okay.
And it's a hot topic.
Another topic.
Just one comment. I think Councillor Mao also touched on that one. That what is the incentive for the landlords or owners of the house to allow their renters to do this?
Well, short-term short-term rentals, the incentive would be money because they are quite.
Landowner, not for the principal.
Well, if a landowner was willing to rent their part of the house to a long-term renter, you would have to make that decision whether or not you allowed it. And I guess the landlords could, in the rental agreement, restrict short-term rentals as part of the rental tenancy agreement. They could just say, you're not allowed to do this. Whether it's allowed in the municipality or not, I'm going to restrict you.
Yeah, but
or potentially a percentage of the revenue that the tenant got. Like,
yeah.
With this method, the control of who is renting and who to rent it to will be to the tenants who is occupying that one. Mm-hmm. And I don't think landlords will be happy to know. They don't know who is coming to their house and living there for safety, for things. So
that would be up to them. Yeah.
Great.
It's a good point.
It stays long-term rental.
Yeah, then it stays a long-term rental, and then you know who it is.
But the one thing that we talked about is if you put it in your residential tenancy agreement that you could do these short-term rentals subject to my approval. So it just creates a little more work for the landlord if they're prepared to do it. And then, you negotiate, I want 10% of whatever you make, And then I think it still preserves long-term rental because it has to be a tenant in there to begin with. And, let's say this is a student and I think that's the example that you used, Catherine, is a student and they're gone for 2 months. So, maybe they rent it out as short-term rental for 2 months so they can come back when the school year starts. So there's all these little kind of different possibilities.
Thank you.
And what is the difference in that in between the subletting or subleasing a house and short-term rental?
I think we're going to have an offline discussion about that because we usually don't go back and forth, but you're raising some really important comments. And I would say that the difference between, 25 years ago was if you wanted to rent a unit in your house, you, the owner of the house, had to live in the house and then you could rent the downstairs. We changed that, you know, based on, you know, the enforceability of us to be able to deal with complaints from neighbors. But what that did was open up more of an investment market to be able to buy properties and then rent them out. When we did the OCP, the concept of the OCP was that we were going to build density. And, you know, it was like, this is going to work. It's just a puzzle, right? Well, not really. We were going to build density in order for people to move out of single family homes into town centers and then open up single family homes for families because we had so many empty bedrooms. It sort of worked, but what happened was a lot of people bought the multifamily units and then rented them out for renters or for short-term rentals. So, you know, there's a lot of, some of our actions have contributed to this over the years. And, you know, we have to realize that. Thank you for your comments. Yes.
It was actually really interesting to hear all these discussions. One quick question that I have, that with this new regulation, how does it affect the, you know, the secondary units that doesn't have a principal, you know, resident in there? We know that there are so many of them in North Vancouver and everywhere, and they're used solely for renting out in Airbnb, you know, and nobody's living there. So is that going to stop them from doing that, or, you know, from now on, or?
Mr. Milburn, do you have a comment to that?
I understand the question. It's, you're saying there's lots of examples. There's a unit,
yeah,
it's a suite or otherwise, and it's being just rented out on short term, and there's no principal resident.
Yeah.
So what we're proposing is that by creating a requirement, a condition in order to operate as a short-term rental, you would have to have a principal resident on that, in that unit first, and then you could temporarily while you're on holiday or rent out a room while you're there. That would capture more of those problematic units that are simply just
hotel rooms.
No long-term renter. It's just like turning over every night, because under the provincial proposal, we would know where they all are, and so we'd follow up with them. We would ask for whether or not there's a principal resident and ask for a proof of that. And if they couldn't provide that proof, like in the circumstances you can, then we wouldn't issue the business license and we would enforce the bylaw.
Okay, because I remember when I moved to Vancouver 2 years ago, you know, we rented the basement unit in North Vancouver for a month, and it was solely, you know, used for renting on Airbnb. So,
thank you, Jim. Can I just ask you a question? Did you hear any of that?
Yeah, I heard all that.
Oh, you did? Okay, good. Good.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Kelly?
Thank you.
I just want to say that I'm really enthused by the primary residence. I think that really solves a whole lot, and it gives tenants rights in negotiation with their landlord to also have some income should they go away. But I do want to call things back. I know there was discussion about worry about taking away money from tourism. I might be missing if that was referenced to something other than the MRDT, but I think the MRDT came into play, that NDP brought that in as part of their 30-point plan in 2018. And here we are, 2023, the option to raise your tax, the municipal tax for that MRDT by 1%. And that 1% goes to the Affordable Housing Fund. I know I heard, I can to this day still hear it, April 26, 2021, when the North Shore Tourism had a delegation to council, and those ladies or those presenters said how tourism, there's very little affordable housing, and there's also very little ways governments can get taxes for that affordable housing. So I think they've had the 1% increase. I think staff applied for it in last year towards the end. So you have 9 months to apply and have that 1% being channeled in. I think we need new revenue sources for that affordable housing fund. So I encourage that step.
And the gentleman no, you're good? Okay, what is the total amount of the Affordable Housing Fund right now? Rick?
It's just over 4 million.
4 million, okay.
Sorry?
That's just cash.
Yeah, that's just cash.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I don't see any other.
So what's the next steps that we're we're doing it.
Well, I think it's gonna come back, staff's gonna come back again, and they've taken all of our questions and our comments, that there's 3 of us that still have to go through the one-on-one process. I think there's been some questions that have been asked, and staff is gonna come back, provide some more information and answer those questions for us.
In a workshop or at council?
Probably, I mean, well,
This
no,
is
no,
the
no,
problem.
it's just, these are big issues, right? So these are big ones. Anyway, I'm gonna go to staff. What is your concept, Mr. Milburn?
Your worship, and I guess this is, I think we have some fairly clear direction from council tonight in terms of the preferences. So I think the opportunity is there that we could come back with some bones of how this process could look in a regular meeting.
Yeah.
However, if that's not the desire of this council, happy to do another workshop and have further conversation. But I think we do have some of the bones that we could bring back.
And if we were to set up like regulations, how long is it going to take to implement those? Like I mean, short-term rentals are yearly, really. I mean, obviously they peak in the summer months, right? But people are traveling from, spring break, May into October. So, they're used year round. What are you thinking as far as implementation of these regulations and notification to the community about these regulations, and how? So that's my first question in regards to how this will move forward. But my second one is the regulations that the provincial government is bringing in, and when are we expecting that to happen? In the fall? Okay, so we've got some time because they need to go together, otherwise it doesn't really work. So we do have some time on this, council. Nothing's happening, until the province gets some sort of database going. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. So in terms of implementation, if council were to pass bylaws, that would take some weeks or months to pass those bylaws. There'd also be likely some engagement component to that as well. So that creates the 3 to 4 month range.
Yeah.
If council then adopts a new regulatory scheme, I think we would want to have an implementation period where we're educating the community, educating the folks that aren't aware, and then we wouldn't start sort of active enforcement activity until after that period. So you'd probably go through 2024 updating folks, educating them, and then asking them and to apply. And then so that in the next license cycle, so in the beginning of 2025, you would try to have as most possible applying and complying. In the case of Vancouver, I think they did a post-implementation analysis after 2 years. Was it 2 years?
They've been, 2019 was the first review, yes.
And so it's not just adoption, education, and then licensing. There's also implementation where you have to actively reach out to those folks that fail to comply. Take at least a couple of years Vancouver found to get, and they still had about 15% non-compliance. So it can take multiple years of enforcement activity.
Okay, so what I'm going to suggest based on that information is that you put the bones together of what you think you've heard from council. I think Councillor Forbes and I will take part into the one-on-one. Obviously, the mayor would like to give his. He was needing to deal with something, and so he wasn't able to be here tonight. So I would suggest that you put some bones together and send us a bit of an information report about what you think you heard to us. And then if there's any sort of big outstanding things that we think we need to come back to have another discussion with, maybe outline sort of a process as far as the implementation, what you just said, maybe write that down and provide that information for us. And then we can, if we do feel like there's a need to discuss more other than a regular agenda item, that we can give you that heads up. Catherine?
I am not in favor of that. I think that we're now on our anyway, I think that it doesn't need to be delayed anymore. He's outlined the timeline, the months it's going to take. You're going to have your sessions so that you will have a better understanding of this. And then we're ready to take a look at the bones created from all of this discussion and all of our concerns and issues that have been raised, and take a look at it before council. So my suggestion is to take this information, have the meeting, and then come back to council with some crafted bylaws for us to vote on.
I think that's what I said.
No, you said to come back to us with an information report. And then if we have any issues with it, we can have more discussion on it. And then it could go back to council.
I think information reports are just sent as an email. It's just an email that goes out to council and you just take a look at it. And at any time, council in an information report can give a heads up to staff that, oh no, I have some questions, there's some issue. Otherwise, it just sort of moves forward through the process.
I think you're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
The only difference, I think, is we're contemplating that if in fact, as a result of this information that we're sharing with one another in the next couple of weeks, a showstopper comes. Questions asked that you really have to get council to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Last meeting.
Okay, and Jordan, you're good?
Good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna thank everybody for coming. Thanks for the residents for coming out this evening. Thank you, Councilor Hanson. And I'll take a motion to adjourn the workshop, seconded by Councilor Ma, and all those in favor of closing the hearing.
Thank you, Acting Mayor.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone.